Paul Bunyan.
Read and presented by George Pitropogiannakis.
Many years ago, most of America was covered with great forests. As more and more people settled land, these forests had to be cleared. The settlers needed the forest land to live on, and they needed the trees for wood to build new homes. The men who cut down the trees for the settlers were called loggers. These loggers worked in lumber camps all across the country. All day long they worked hard, but in the evenings they liked to sit around the camps and tell stories, funny stories and tall tales. And their favorite stories were about Paul Bunyan, the mightiest logger that ever lived. Paul Bunyan was born in the state of Maine, but he was not like any other baby you have ever seen.
What can we do about this son of ours? He has grown 2 feet taller since yesterday.
His father built a huge cradle for Paul and anchored it out on the ocean so the waves would rock the baby to sleep. But one day, Paul started bouncing in his cradle, and that started huge waves that washed away whole towns and villages on the shore. When Paul was older, his father, who was a logger, took him into the woods to live. There, Paul spent his boyhood helping his father cut down trees. One winter, there was a very strange snowstorm in the logging camp where Paul lived.
Look! The snow is blue!
The blue snow kept falling for months. The whole logging camp was buried under it. I just finished measuring the snow. It's 200 feet deep over in the valley. It was so cold that winter that everyone's words froze just as fast as they were spoken.
I'll have to wait till your words thaw out next spring, Paul, to find out what you said.
The men let their beards grow long to keep their faces warm. Hey, watch where you're going. That's my beard you're stepping on. Finally, they made a rule that anyone with a beard more than 6 feet long had to tuck the end of it in his boots.
But it doesn't leave room for my legs.
One day, Paul was out looking for wood for his fireplace when that looks like 2 little ears sticking out of the snow.
Why, it's a baby ox. Poor little thing, it's blue with cold.
Paul decided to keep the little ox for a pet. He named him Babe. The funny thing about Babe was that even after he thawed out, his coat was blue.
I guess that snow has colored you blue forever.
Babe followed Paul everywhere he went.
It reminds me of when you were little, Paul. Every time I look at him, he seems to have grown a foot taller.
In the spring, Paul built a barn for Babe, but the next morning, "That's strange. I know I put Babe in the barn here last night."
At last, Paul found Babe. Well, look at that! He outgrew that barn in just one night. Not long after he found Babe, Paul got an idea.
Father, I think I'm ready to start a logging camp of my own now.
Good. You may take some of my men with you.
So Paul gathered together a crew of the finest loggers in the country, and they set out for the mountains to the west. Paul set up his camp on the Onion River. Men, when we finish this logging camp, it will be the largest in the world. Paul's fame as a logger soon spread. Every day.
There are 50 more men waiting to join your camp.
Good. I'll come right over and build a few more bunkhouses.
In order to save space, Paul built the bunkhouses to fit on top of each other.
It's time for bed, men.
That way, Paul would stack them up at night. In the morning, he would take them down to let the men come out.
Good morning, Paul.
Paul's camp became so big that the men had to take a week's supply of food with them when they walked from one end of it to the other. Of course, it took lots of careful planning to feed so many men. Paul and his chief cook, Sourdough Sam, talked about it for hours.
We'll just have to make the dining room tables longer.
But the tables are 6 miles long already. Even with those roller skates, the boys hardly finish serving breakfast before it's time for lunch.
It was Sourdough Sam who invented sourdough flapjacks. These were cooked on a griddle 2 miles long. The cookhouse boys greased the griddle by skating back and forth on it with bacon strapped to their feet. Ola, the giant blacksmith, made a huge kettle for cooking the soup.
Here's the kettle you wanted. Paul, it holds 1,100 gallons.
When it was time for supper,
The soup needs more vegetables.
I row out with another boatload and shovel them in.
Paul's first camp was big, all right, but it was nothing compared to the one he built later in North Dakota. There, the dining room was longer than ever. So long, Sam. I won't see you till tomorrow, I guess.
Now, you might as well stay overnight at the other end of the tables and drive back in the morning.
The bunks in the new camp were 18 decks high.
Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, Mike. We better start down, I guess, or then we'll be late for breakfast.
In North Dakota, Paul agreed to cut down all the trees in just 1 month.
I think I'll have to send for the 7 X-Men to help with this job.
The 7 axemen were famous woodsmen who could chop down trees faster than anyone except Paul himself. With the help of the 7 axemen, the logging was finished in 3 weeks. But
Now, how am I going to get rid of all those tree stumps?
Johnny Inkslinger, who helped Paul figure out his problems, thought of a plan.
Let's send for some large fire hoses. I have an idea.
Johnny knew that Babe, the blue ox, did not like to get his feet wet. A few days later,
The fire hoses are here, Johnny.
Good. Now we'll cover the whole country with water.
When all of the ground in North Dakota was covered with water, Babe had to step from stump to keep from wetting his feet. His heavy weight drove the stumps 6 feet under the ground, and the ground was cleared. After that, Paul had another problem.
Now that the trees are gone, the wind from the Pacific coast will blow too hard across this farmland.
Maybe we can think of a way to put up a windbreak.
We could build a plain old wooden fence, about 200 feet high.
It would cost a lot of money to keep fixing a fence like that. Say, Paul, what are all those holes in the ground down there?
Those holes were made by prairie dogs. And that gives me an idea.
Paul hurried back to camp and had a special cook shack built with holes in the floor.
Sam, move all your flapjack batter and half of your men into this new cook shack.
Next, the special cook shack was hitched up to Babe the blue ox, and he pulled it out to the deserted prairie dog town.
Now, Sam, every time we stop, you pour your flapjack batter into the prairie dog holes through these openings in the floor.
Owl followed, plugging up the holes with blocks of wood. Paul knew that the batter would soon start to rise. And if it had no room to rise, it would push up the ground. The next day,
well, there she goes. In no time at all, we'll have some mountains here to keep out the wind.
And a few days later,
well, now, that's a pretty nice range of mountains, even if I do say so myself. I guess that's as good a windbreak as anyone could ask for.
These mountains were first called the Sourdough Mountains in honor of the way Paul made them. But later the name was changed, and they are now called the Rocky Mountains. When his work was finished in North Dakota, Paul and his men decided to move further west. After a few days of walking, they came to a desert. It was very hot. Paul became so tired from the heat that he took his axe and dragged it along the ground. Naturally, this made a huge hole in the ground. Somebody afterward named this hole the Grand Canyon. There wasn't a tree in sight. Every time Paul stopped to rest, 40 men sat in his shadow to cool off. At last, the men became so hot and tired that they couldn't walk another step.
You stay here and rest, men. I'll go on with Babe and see what lies ahead.
That night, Paul came to a farm.
I need food and water for my men. Do you have anything to sell me, farmer?
I haven't any water, but you can buy all the corn you want.
Fine. I'll take all the corn you have.
Paul loaded the bags of corn on Babe's back and started back to his men. By the time he arrived, it was noon of the next day, and the sun was shining hotter than ever.
What's that noise? Seems like I hear something popping in those bags.
The sun had made the corn so hot that it was popping. Soon the air was filled with popcorn. The men thought it was snow. Snow, snow!
Look! It's snowing! We're saved! I never saw a snowstorm start so suddenly.
Let's have a snowball fight.
My, it's getting cold.
The men were so happy about the snow that Paul didn't want to spoil their fun by telling them it was only popcorn. Paul and his men started west again while they were still feeling happy.
That snowstorm really saved us.
Yes, but my ears almost got frozen. I couldn't find my cap.
After a few days of walking, they came to a valley.
This looks like a good place for us to stop a while and grow some vegetables.
I don't know about that. The soil looks good, but there doesn't seem to be any water around here.
But Paul thought there was water, so he took his axe and the spout of water that he started can still be seen in Yellowstone National Park. It is called Old Faithful. Not long after that, the men arrived at their new camp. One day, Chris Crosshole came into Paul's office. I brought you something, Paul.
What is it?
It's a dog, a hunting dog.
I love to go hunting, but I've never been able to find a hunting dog that could keep up with me.
Paul noticed that the dog's front legs were much shorter than his back legs.
This dog is different from all others I've seen. Maybe I can use him.
Paul hurried to the cookhouse.
I need some of those famous sourdough flapjacks of yours.
What are you using them for this time, Paul?
It's a secret, Sam. You'll have to wait and see.
Paul took Skookum, the new dog, and the sourdough flapjacks to his office.
Here you are, Skookum. Go to it, boy.
For weeks, Paul stuffed Skookum with sourdough flapjacks, day and night. When the sourdough began to rise, Skookum started rising also. He rose, and he rose, and he rose. At the end of 2 months, Paul never had to worry about a hunting dog again. Skookum never got tired, no matter how far he ran, because he was always running downhill. About this time, Paul got a letter asking him to come and do some logging in Nevada. So he hitched Babe to the piece of land that the camp was on and moved the whole camp. As soon as Paul took a look at the trees in Nevada, he got worried.
Look at those thorns, Ola. They must be 70 feet high.
Those thorns will keep the trees from falling down even after they've been cut.
But Paul, as always, thought of a way to solve the problem.
I know. We'll blast the trees out with dynamite and the thorns at the same time.
And so, a few days later,
But the next morning, wait till Paul sees this. Well, look at that! The trees have landed back in their holes, right side up. Paul was pretty upset about this at first, but soon he thought of another plan.
The only way to get those trees off the land is to drive them underground.
So, for 39 weeks, the men were busy building the biggest pile driver ever made. When it was finished, it was so tall that the clouds going by kept knocking off the top of it. Finally, Paul put in a hinge so he could let down the top whenever he saw a cloud coming.
When everything was ready, Paul put the pile driver in place.
Babe then pulled a weight to the top of it. The weight drove the tree 14 feet below the ground, and the crash was heard 88 miles away. After that, the trees were driven underground at a rate of one every 3 minutes. In just 9 days, Nevada was as bare as any desert you ever saw. Well, you can see that it didn't take Paul long to clear off any piece of land, one way or another, once he set his mind to it. Within a few years, Paul Bunyan had taken care of all the big logging, jobs that had to be done in this country. So he took his hunting dog, Skookum, and Babe the Blue Ox, and went off into the mountains to spend the rest of his life just having fun. The end. Paul Bunyan.
Read and presented by George Pitropogiannakis.